from the chief guest. Fortunately, this present duty has been simplified for me because the spontaneous and generous applause you just gave him speaks far more eloquently than anything I could say. Indeed, we've had the privilege of hearing not just a carefully prepared and researched speech, but also an exquisite piece of oratory. It is therefore left to me only to add, you have honored me in a manner I have never experienced before, nor am likely to experience again. Thank you. Then it gives me great pleasure to recognize the kind words of the two guest speakers selected by the organizers, who could not have made a more appropriate choice, in the sense that Mr. Lowen Lama is the first member of staff whose appointment I recommended when he took over the geography department from me. Mrs. Margareta Pertel, whose speech was read to us, goes back even further than Mr. Lama, in the sense that when I joined the Homes, I taught her as a student of class 8. I did not believe their comments of a bygone era could leave me so emotionally drained. And so I hope I will be forgiven if I limit my gratitude to saying a very simple, though heartfelt thank you. At the same time, I must mention how privileged I feel to know that right here in Kalimpong are a number of former students who also were in the opening batch when I joined the Homes in 1958. How many teachers can make this claim? To meet students they first taught 56 years ago. I refer to people like Sylvia Donald, Rajendra Chaudhary, unfortunately isn't here today. Praful Rao, whose father and I had such a close association for many, many years, and to Randaraj Taman, who taught me how to fish in Botani's rivers. Then I would be failing in my duty if I did not acknowledge the obvious debt I owe to the 3 OGB associations of Sikkim, London, and Kalimpong for being brave enough to publish this book. Allow me to explain how this came about. 3 years ago, in the course of correspondence, I mentioned that I had decided to write the book. I was more than taken aback on receiving a letter from Mrs. J.C. Pradhan, at the time president of the Sikkim Association, Grammar Association, to say their association will be happy to publish the book. I have always had the closest of ties with this association, possibly because of the seminars they so kindly arranged for me to conduct in Gangtok schools. I had hardly got over this pleasant surprise of Jayasree's offer when I received a note from Margareta Pertel asking me to send her the manuscript, and the London Association will publish the book. As Margareta was due out for the Homes birthday that year, and I was aware that Jayashree had invited her to visit Gangtok, I hit on the bright idea that both of them may jointly like to publish the book, and then ask them to consider co-opting the Kalimpong OGB Association. Because I could see the most appropriate place for the book to be printed was here in Kalimpong by an ex-home student here in Manipur, both of whose parents had served on the staff of these firms with my wife and myself, and were personal friends of ours. And so let me close this rather long response by saying a very special thank you to these three associations who having not only published the book, but are responsible for organizing this program and all subsequent programs connected with the book. And now let me come to the comments after the response. One winter, I was spending a holiday in Kerala with my nephew. I call him my nephew, but he's more a son to me. One day, during lunch, he suddenly turned to me and said, "Uncle, why have you written this book? Why are you writing this book?" Having completed 12 chapters or so, I should have been able to give him a pretty prompt reply. But it took me some time to answer. I have written this book for two reasons. Firstly, to express my appreciation of an extraordinary gentleman, John Anson Graham. And secondly, and equally important, to express my appreciation of an extraordinary institution known worldwide as the home. Ladies and gentlemen, has it occurred to you that the only reason why all of us are met together in this hall today is because of our connection with the name of Dr. Graham? He is the connecting link with all of us assembled here today. But for these homes, our lives may never have crossed. Ships passing in the night, so to speak. 45 years ago, Dr. Minto wrote a very fine biography of our founder called Graham of Kalimpong. My book is not intended to add to that biography in any way. What I have attempted to do is to stress the word extraordinary. Graham's ability to see the bigger picture. Allow me to outline in a few minutes the transformation he brought about here in Kalimpong on arriving in 1889, exactly 125 years ago. The Scots University mission land occupied some 4 acres. It is familiar to anyone from Kalimpong and consists of the land on either side of the road going up to what was originally called the Charteris Hospital. It extends a half kilometer beyond to the north and another half kilometer towards the river. When Graham arrived in Kalimpong, the property on this land consisted of a single building which housed both the offices and residence of the administrator at the time, by the name of Reverend Sutherland. Sutherland's dream was to build the first church in Kalimpong, and he asked for Graham's assistance. Such was the response he received that in just 3 years, him Such was the response he received that in just 3 years, they not only raised the money to actually build the church, but to actually build the church, the magnificent McFarlane Church. In those days, it so dominated the Kalimpong skyline. It is said the church was visible everywhere from Durping Hill to the very door. In the next 3 years, Graham built the Charteris Hospital and Leprosy. And then do you know what he built next? The arts and crafts, known as the industries. But does it not occur to you a little strange that after building a church, that much you could understand after all he was a priest, after building a hospital in leprosy, medical work was frequently synonymous with missionary work. Does it not occur to you a little odd that the next thing that he did was a place for producing arts and crafts? I mean, where is the connection? Do you know why he seems to have gone up at a tangent and built the industry? Let me explain. At the time that we arrived here in Kalimpong, Dr. Graham made the industries and employed in it women folk only. At that time, predominantly lecturing ladies. And he did that, and everything was fine. They worked very hard on materials, on leatherwork, and woodwork. And they made all sorts of items to be sold. The sale in Kalimpong was a little limited. So Dr. Graham, in the course of his travels through the Darjeeling plantations, the duars and gardens, and right up to us, used to take these items with him. And he was a sort of sales manager. And in those days, it wasn't easy for the planters to get to the big cities. And they welcomed all this stuff. And they bought it and paid handsomely for it. He brought the money back to Kalimpong, took a certain amount of it, which was plowed back into the industries, and the rest he paid the women. No big deal. No big deal. It was the biggest deal imaginable. He paid those women, and this was the first time in their lives that they knew what it was to receive a salary for doing a job of work. This is the fact. He gave them the dignity of earning a salary for doing a job of work for the first time. Having done that, 6 years he did all these. They then went on leave to the UK, back to Scotland. One would have thought they would have relaxed, but instead of that he wrote his first book with a very, very interesting title, On the Threshold of Three Closed Lands. Absolutely beautiful book. And I think it's perfectly clear that he had a dream that his mission would be able to cross this threshold and get into the three closed lands. But it was never to be. Because by now he had another obsession. In the course of his travels through the tea gardens, he became aware of a certain sickness. He used the word sickness. Because he found running around on the gardens the illegitimate children of the British planting community and the local picker women. But what shattered him was this. He said the father can never accept the child. This is what is so bad. What hope does the child have with that sort of attitude? And because of the fact that frequently the children looked different, they weren't all that accepted by the women's community. And so it was that Graham found himself having to try and do something about seeing about these children. He spoke to his parent committee in Scotland. They declined. Not because they thought this was a bad idea, but they said, you've got enough to do. After all, he was the superintendent of the hospital, of the leprosy, sales manager of the industries. Mrs. Graham was actually in charge, and full-time pastor of the church. And it was quite obvious that when Sutherland retired, he would take over as administrator of the entire mission. And so it was that they refused to do this. Graham then decided that he would just have to take the plunge himself. And we all know that this is a little bit of history, that on the 24th of September 1900, he founded the home by taking into care 6 small children in a rented shed at the Peak. Everybody knows that. But what everybody doesn't know is that within the next 6 weeks, just the next 6 weeks, between the 24th of September and the 8th of November, he received a request to take in another 26 children. And who was it who recommended these children? The same Para Saabs on the tea gardens who wanted to get rid of these children. They were an embarrassment to them. They did. We'll pay father, you can't ask the father for money. We'll give the money. You take in these 26 children. In 6 weeks, he had got a reply for another 26. And what does the great man do? He doesn't back down over here. He leases from the government 100 acres of farm, or 100 acres of land. A little later, he was to lease another 300. And he gave orders on the 8th of November 1900 for the first building to be constructed. It took a year to be constructed. And in that year, he formed a little board of management. And needless to say, great thoughts. The bigger picture. He said, we don't need teachers at this stage, we need a farm. So he brought a certain amount of land under cultivation. And the first appointment he made was for a professional farmer from Scotland to come out and run this little farm. And on the 9th of November, the cottage was ready. And who does he get to open it? None other than Sir John Woodburn. I'd like you to just think about this. In those days, don't forget, Delhi wasn't the capital of India, Calcutta was. And so the governor of Bengal was the senior most governor. He was number one, he was the most powerful man in the country. And Dr. Graham arranges for this man to make the journey by train to Gailkola, after which he has to ride up on a horse to Kalimpong. And the next day he comes up and what does he do? He cuts a ribbon across the door of a solitary cottage on a barren hillside. That was what the most powerful man in India was called upon to do and arranged by none other than the great man, who was always able to see the great man. After that, of course, the story is well known, I won't go into it. But in the next 22 years, Graham built all the cottages, the whole school, with the exception of the KG, the technical block, and the Lady Sheriff, all the private houses, except for Graham House and Jubilee. The hospital, can you imagine? He only had 130 children in the homes at the time. And he orders a hospital with 50 beds, a 50-bedded hospital, and an isolation ward to take another 60 in case there was an an outbreak of an infectious disease. He met Lucy King and all the departments. And he does all that in 22 years. The last cottage he built was Wisdom. And when after finishing Wisdom, he stopped building cottages. Not because he ran out of land, he had plenty of land. Not because he ran out of money, he had plenty of money. But there was no longer the demand. He had so made the people of the tea estates ashamed of this, and the Barasat in Calcutta, that orders were given that these people needed to behave a lot more, in a more acceptable manner. And so in the next 20 years, from 1922 to 1942, when Graham died, in those 20 years, this went out altogether from Darjeeling and the Duars. But Assam continued. And so it was. He had solved the problem. Mission accomplished. So what happens? Do the homes close down? There's no need for these children? Nothing doing. And this is where the extraordinary institution comes into it. It was able to adapt, it was able to change from that situation to still looking for the underprivileged. But now it changed to children who were partly or completely orphan. Children from broken families. And it was exactly the same thing. But now the area changed. Instead of the tea gardens, it was the border localities of Calcutta. The upcountry railway colonies, and Assam still had a large number of children coming in there. Then again, this 1942, Dr. Graham died. 1947 was independence. And they had to do something about, because there was a very strong attitude. See, you've got to understand, in those days, Dr. Graham had purely expatriate staff. All the teachers, all the house parents, all the department heads were all expatriates. And there needed to be a feeling that this was a little bit of Scotland stuck in there. And so it was, the board management and everybody else needed to change the sentences. And they did so. As I said, this happened in 1947. From the 1950s, the first step they took was to take in day scholars. From the town, let's keep the relationship with the town better. And you need to ask people like Mr. Tony, many of the people, Gangaraj tonight, every day the day scholars walked up, and every day they walked back. Nowadays, of course, they come up in father's air-conditioned car, chauffeur driven, with the music blaring, and then the car comes back to collect them to take them down. In those days, they walked both ways, and they wore a whole lot of shoes. But this was it. So the first step was taken in the 50s to look after these scholars. I arrived here in 1950, and I was acting for Dr. Mentor, because he came out a year later. And I remember doing the admissions of day scholars. There were 120 day scholars, and I took in 9. So the grand total of day scholars in 1959 was 129. The next year, the next decade was the really big decade, that of the 1960s. Tibet had been invaded, and so suddenly Kalimpong, in fact the whole district, was flooded with Tibetan refugees. Dr. Graham's daughter, elder daughter, raised money and started what came to be known as the Tibetan Refugee Fund, TRF for short. Fortunately, the person who got interested in this was the great Daisy Flowers. Whatever Tibetans have passed through this institution, they are what they are today because of this work and the support that she got. But this wasn't the only change, just Tibetan refugees being taken. Sikkim, which, try and understand, in those days, Sikkim was not a state of India. They had their own Sharia. They were partly independent, but they had a certain independent government. And the education department there was interested in children coming to the homes. And I twice went up there to select the children. But I'm afraid we rather fell out on this particular score because this was meant to be for children on merit. But they wanted to, the people that they were recommending were people who they chose. And we weren't going to agree with this, and that phased out very soon. But the third change was a very strong one. Indian government had poured crores of rupees into Bhutan for the education of Bhutanese. And they took full advantage of this. They flooded out the whole of the district. Dr. Graham's homes was the number one American. And the people who came here, I think I don't have to stress it. They were people who were a credit to themselves, to their homes, and to their country. And so it was the big change took place in the decade of the 60s. I took over in 1971, I opened the door a little further, and for the first time we took in a larger number of children, Bengali children from Calcutta, and I opened the doors to children from Nepal. And all these communities brought their own culture And they didn't change it all. Their culture was preserved. But they also got something from the homes. And I don't think that I'm bluffing myself. But the OGBs of these decades are the ones who really got themselves involved in the homes today. And these are the people who we hope will be able to stimulate those who are now in to support the next generation. In 13 years, the homes changed from being a one community school to a multi-community institution. I'd like to close by referring to a talk I gave OGBs in Calcutta a few months ago. It wasn't a talk, I preached, so I didn't have much chance of getting away from this. But let me share the thought that I had. I arrived here as a young headmaster, and I couldn't get over the fact that this great man, who I sort of made a study of, this great man, there is no memorial to him. The bus that you see out of here, this only came up in the year 2000. I came here in 1958. And there was nothing. He built that magnificent church. I expected to see, at least in marble, if not in marble, in bronze, if not in bronze, in wood, a tribute to Dr. Graham. Nothing. This very hall, from this very stage, the who's who of Indian administration, British administration, has talked from there. Plus, our own Indian ministers, known as a person then the very first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So I thought something over here, nothing. In Jubilee, the house given to him after 50 years of service, nothing there. And I was really worried about this. And the only tribute I could find to him was not one, as I said, put in letters of marble, but the only tribute I could find to him were letters written in cement, which you'll see on the east wall of the chapel. You'll see these words, which I know will be familiar to most of you. Certainly, again, the group of OGBs I'm talking to, they will be familiar with these words. You will see them there. Written in cement. Dr. Graham, comma, who loved children, comma, founded these homes in 1900. And one line of scripture, it was in thine heart. And here, as I said, the more senior I became as a principal, and I met so many people that came from in various schools in the country. I noticed that about 98 or 99% of the schools in the country were founded to honor some saint. Not in Kalimpong, but in Darjeeling or Calcutta, any amount, you just find so many schools named after saints. And there's nothing wrong with that. And then there are very few schools which are named after the person who gave the money, donated the money. So we've got people like Claude Martin having founded the Martiniers. And then we've got the Frank Anthony public schools. But it suddenly occurred to me that while these schools had been founded to honor some saint or honor the person who gave the money, I was working in a school which was founded because a man loved children. What a difference. What a difference. Dr. Graham, who loved children, founded these homes. It was an honor to work in such an institution. And what an honor, what a terrific tribute to have this as our background. We had an extraordinary man in Dr. Graham. We have an extraordinary institution in Dr. Graham. Thank you.